Well, what I'd love to talk about, the future of cities. How do you see the forces that will shape the city of the future? But if architecture is about improving the quality of life, then surely this is right at the heart of architecture. How do we effect that revolution, that transformation? Could I kind of launch straight in? Ian, you're a professor of globalization and development at Oxford University. In the past, you were vice president of the World Bank, chief executive of the South Africa Development Bank, and you advised President Mandela in the past, governments and corporates currently. How do you see the city or the cities of the future? I mean, what are the global trends that are going to shape them?
Well, firstly, I think that cities are the heart of the future. And whenever one thinks about how the future is likely to evolve, it all comes down to what's going to happen in cities. Not only because a growing share of the world's population, by far the majority of the world's population, live in cities, but also because they are the source of energy. They are the dynamism. It's the ecosystem of cities that will determine, and the ideas, the inventions, the energy that comes out of cities that will determine whether this is the best century ever for humanity, or whether we have a rather calamitous century. And that's all going to be shaped by cities, and of course, in turn, will shape cities. So for me, first and foremost, is the question of how do the ecosystems of cities evolve, you at the heart of that, but how do buildings, people, amenities, and commerce interact in a way that makes them livable, makes them the place that people want to be and thrive. And that, I think, is being challenged now as a result of the pandemic more severely than probably has been at any time since the Second World War. Of course, other big forces are going to shape the future of cities too. I think of demographics as an absolutely key factor. How many people, what age are they going to be? Which people from where are going to live in cities? And that's evolving much more rapidly than any demographers even imagined in terms of the rate of change in fertility, for example, increase in aging. Climate change is going to be a key driver and shape many things, and you've worked intensely on this. Some cities might be underwater, coastal cities like Mumbai or Miami or Jakarta. If oceans rise by a couple of meters, which is what some are fearing, not only from ocean rise, from surges, from Hurricane Sandys that are more intense, from salinity intrusion as aquifers are depleted and ocean rises, from lack of water supply, from droughts. There are many factors related to climate change and extreme weather that will affect cities. Of course, food supplies will be one of those, and cities are particularly vulnerable to fragility in food supplies, as we've seen from many riots in many cities over time. Other factors which will be key drivers are, of course, the future of globalization and the world economy. A lot of cities are the hubs of connectivity. Hubs of connectivity through airports, which is one of the reasons they've been particularly vulnerable in the pandemic, but also the hubs of connectivity, seaports. The growth of cities is mostly seaborne growth or seaside growth, and that container traffic becomes very, very important in that, and connectivity. And the nature of jobs and income distribution, economic growth. Are cities going to become more inclusive or more divided? Will depend on what jobs are being created, how cities are managed, and whether they're places where everyone thrives or only certain groups of people can thrive. So there are many megatrends, of which I've just named a few, which will shape the future of cities, but they are, in a way, the center, the hive in which it all happens. And unless the hive is healthy, there's no humming.
If you took an optimistic view, where do those trends, do you think, lead in terms of, if one was to visit the city of the future, into the future, what tangibly, what do you think you would be seeing?
I think it would be as different as cities are to cities of hundreds of years ago, but in the space of, if you're saying the year 2100, just 80 years time, I think they would be largely silent because we wouldn't have combustion engines, and we just have the bustle of people. We'd have hopefully the humming of the bees and the sound of birds and other sounds. They'd be much, much greener. Roofs would be green, walls would be green, as we've seen in buildings. They would be pedestrianized largely, and I've seen some of the great designs that you've projected for this. And they would be places where people are basically doing what cities, I think, are meant to do, which is allow interaction, allow people, whether it's the 15-minute city or whether it's in bigger spaces with rapid electric fossil fuel transport systems shuttling people to different parts of the city, doesn't really matter. But cities offer everything. And that's what makes them unique. What you can get in a city, you just can't get in a rural or other area. And it's that which will be splendid in the future of cities, in my view. It's the ability of a diverse range of people to have everything they want very nearby. Some people might like wonderful jazz music, and other people might like walking and cycling, and you can do it all in a city of the future without being run over or finding that your favorite jazz club is being closed down and turned into a shopping mall or something. So I think they will be very healthy environments. Already the data, of course, shows us that cities are much healthier places, despite the romanticism we all have about rural life. Life expectancy is better in cities, and people's health, even physical health, interesting. Now, people walk more in cities than they do in the countryside, and use cars less. So that will just be accentuated, I hope, in the future. They'll become even more bustling because societies account for innovation. And I've been doing a lot of work on productivity and efficiency, innovation, invention in cities, because they're diverse people coming together geographically. My view is that they will be the most dynamic places. And of course, that requires that we allow cities to be diverse, not only in terms of migration, but also different groups from different backgrounds, different ages, cohabiting in close proximity is vital. I'm worried about remote work in this respect, because I think there's some convenience in remote work and efficiency, and obviously it's great having this remote interview. But if it's taken too far, it could be very dangerous for cities. So my optimism about the future is that actually people still want to come together in offices, in workspaces. Office, I think, will be a very old-fashioned sounding word in the year 2100. But come together collegially, come together to brainstorm over lovely coffee, and share ideas. And if you want to call it an office to be old-fashioned, that would be fine. But it's basically a place where people can be creative and bounce off each other, spark off each other in ways that I don't think they'll do in rural areas, and I don't think they'll do remotely. That's my vision of the future.
I think that you've anticipated two questions. In a way, the remoteness of Zoom and screens and work at home is almost kind of replicated in the car-borne city. So what you're really saying is that your vision of the future is one of the dense, compact, walkable city, not the spread out suburban car-borne sprawl.
That's right. I'm sure there will still be suburbs, but hopefully not suburbs joined to the hub of a city by congested motorways of 6 lanes or 8 lanes. If we're just going to keep adding lanes to deal with it, that's the recipe for disaster. And of course, concrete and cement are not. It's going to take a long time, I think, to get carbon out of concrete, cement, and steel. So thinking in new ways about construction is going to be vital. So it might still be that some cities where space is abundant have a big footprint, but I think that footprint will look very different in terms of energy intensity and in other ways in a city of the future, because there'll be rapid transport systems, shared transport systems, which are fossil free, and perhaps suburban hubs as well. I see that as one of the trends that we'll move to as well. So sort of hub and spoke sort of models.
In other words, some of the changing patterns of mobility could revitalize the suburbs in terms of robotic commutes, which might be a time of leisure, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, the city, city of London, so many cities' footprints now are shaped by the invention of underground railways and subways, and what that made possible, together with other public transport systems. So a revolution in that. And, you pioneered this in Masdar many years ago, that I had the pleasure of visiting. But that sort of ability to connect seamlessly with very low energy intensity could revitalize the suburbs.
I guess also that you've answered another question, and that is, would you agree with a proposition that I've advanced, that really the pandemic hasn't changed or will not change anything? It will seem as if it has in the short term, but essentially what it's done is magnified trends that were already evident. But how would you respond to some of the kind of doomsday critics who see the exodus from the city?
Yeah, I argue in my new book Rescue, which is about the long-term impact of the pandemic, that it hasn't changed anything permanently. It's been a great accelerator, as you say, a great magnifier. I think it's revealed and exacerbated underlying trends, whether they're in globalization, whether they're in work and in other areas. The one possible trend that it has changed, at least for me, maybe not for you, is business travel. I do think that is going to be slightly reduced permanently, because I think people will substitute some remote meetings for what were physical before. But in other respects, I don't see it as that. I think that in terms of cities, there's a risk. And I think we need to recognize the risk that the pandemic has caused in order to counter it, in order to make sure that it doesn't eventuate. And that risk is that firms are saving a lot of money by basically closing down their offices, by having people carry a lot of the costs at home of working at home. They don't have to pay the rent, they don't have to pay the heating, etc. And we are seeing in professional services firms, like law firms, I don't know, architecture firms, but in many professional service firms and in technology firms, we're seeing the CEOs say that this is going to be permanently hybrid. And of course, people that have good times a private office at home and facilities at home are very happy with that, because it reduces their commute and it gives them more flexibility. I've been arguing against that and believe that we should be encouraging people to come back, not in the same way with rigid hours, 5 days a week, 9 to 5, but in more flexible ways. We should be encouraging people back to the city. And there are two main reasons for it. The one is, I believe most jobs are apprenticeships, certainly architecture, certainly academia, certainly law, etc. We learn by observing, by being close to people. And you have, I'm sure thousands of mentees over your time, and I have a few. This would not have happened remotely. It's impossible to imagine an apprenticeship relationship being a remote relationship, because so much of what happens is informal. So much of what happens is questioning. And Zoom and remote meetings are extremely hierarchical. One person sets the meeting, another people attends, and you don't talk at the same time, and you certainly don't interrupt. And it's very difficult to challenge. It's seen as a public gesture when you challenge. Whereas privately, when you walking out of a meeting with someone, you can ask the question, why did that happen, and speak to them over a coffee or something. So I think apprenticeship will be severely undermined by remote work. And the second thing that I believe will happen to these firms that are wanting to go remote is that they'll lose in innovation. I interviewed dozens of CEOs about the experience of remote work over the last 15 months. And they all said it was great and efficient, and they were surprised how well it worked. And then I asked them the question if any of them had had a transformative idea. Had any of them done anything new? Had any of them had an effective brainstorming that really came up with new ideas? And they all said no. And that, I think, is the problem, is that I don't think that you can spark properly with diverse groups in an effective way remotely, not with the technologies we have at the moment. And that leads me to think that firms really do need to encourage people to come back. And of course, many people don't have private offices at home. Many people are working, sitting at the end of their beds. And the more junior people with small kids, with noise, with lack of privacy, suffer most. So it reinforces hierarchies, remote work, and that's what you don't want to do in effective organizations. So my hope is that the pandemic will not have a permanent impact on offices. There's a big issue which I'm sure you know a lot more than I do about, which is public transport systems and how they're going to thrive in a world where you have much less commute. And this can create a vicious circle, particularly if people start paying taxes and rates outside cities, CBD areas and other areas. So the whole finances and economies of cities are very fragile, and it's vital that public transport systems, metro systems, subway systems, public bus systems, but also rates are paid if cities are to thrive in the future. And that's going to be, I think, another challenge coming out of the pandemic. We need to ensure that we get the ecosystem back, and then all the small businesses that cluster around offices, whether it's for food or having your hair cut, not a problem you and I have, Norman, but others, and in other ways. So I think I'm an optimist, and Rescue's an optimistic book, arguing that this could be a turning point for the better. But it requires us facing up to what business as usual will bring. And I fear that business as usual, which will not only lead to more pandemics if we don't really do something to stop them, more financial crises, more cyber attacks, but also lead to a withering of the city is a danger. And that's why I feel passionately that we need to confront this and ensure that cities thrive.
I mean, business as usual conjures up by the very phrase, the relationship between public and private initiatives. As you know, I mean, Mike Bloomberg postulated in his book, Climate of Hope, the proposition that issues of climate change, for example, were too important to be left to governments who could not act quickly enough, and that the initiative really rested with mayors of cities who were far more influential and able to respond more quickly. I mean, how do you see the parallel roles of the private and the public world?
Well, firstly, I think that Mike Bloomberg's spot on. You know, we've had a terrible instinct, which has developed in the post-war period, that if there's a problem, we expect government to solve it. And if it's a global problem like climate change, we expect global government, the UN, to solve the problem. And that's one of the reasons that many problems aren't solved, because so much can be solved by private companies, it can be solved by communities, and it can be solved by cities. New York State accounts for more carbon emissions and greenhouse gases than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. You know, the cities are very, very important, and what they do really matters much more than many countries, depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. So if you focused on climate, an alliance, you know, what in the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations we called C20, 30, 40, of maybe 20 countries, which are the biggest emitters, 40 cities and 30 big companies could account for a huge share of global carbon emissions. And these actors together have power. Cities, even though President Trump hadn't signed up or took the US out of the Paris Agreement, the cities that really mattered stayed in and were doing what they had to do, whether it's New York or Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Francisco, and so on. And that's what matters, that these cities do it. Of course, they need government, and it helps if government sets the right framework. But there's a huge amount that cities can do, and I think there's even more that companies can do, because in the end, companies employ people, companies generate wealth, companies are the engine of everything, including the source of taxation. And so if companies do the right thing, if companies commit, and many are, it's been quite remarkable to see the swing in companies, and even even the oil giants are now saying the right things about moving to zero carbon. Sometimes pushed a bit, but that's what happens in a democracy. Companies get pushed by shareholders, and that's healthy. So we're seeing this, and I think it's one of the great causes of optimism, is that this recognition that it's not the state or the market or citizens, that we're all in it together. States can do some things, but they're often incapable. Companies can do many things, but they can't do everything. And we as citizens have a little bit of power, and through our votes and through our consumer actions, through our choices, can make a difference collectively. So I think this is vital, and it's very important that citizens and companies and cities recognize the power they have and take it.
Ian, you've covered an extraordinary range of topics related to cities. Is there anything that you'd like to, as it were, add for the record that you feel you might not have touched on?
Well, there's so much that can be said, and I look forward to relaxed conversations with you in the future to pursue many of these things. But I do think I guess for me, this is a vital time. And, what you're doing to raise awareness is absolutely critical at this moment. I do fear that there's a danger that governments are so preoccupied with trying to deal with the crisis, rightly so, but some of them can only juggle one ball at a time. The great lesson of the Second World War, when Churchill and Roosevelt were fighting, Churchill was fighting a battle on 5 fronts, and the UK was in danger of being invaded, is that they still had the capacity to reinvent government and reinvent global governance with the UN and everything. And we need to be inspired by that today. We need to be able to be worried about the pandemic and deal with it, but also ensure that cities thrive and that other big challenges we face are dealt with. And I think what you're doing with this series will certainly contribute to that.
Ian, great note to end on. Thank you so much.